My feet are killing me. I knew somebody who had feet like that. They'd walk all over him. Archikashanian was his name. He used to wake up with footprints all over his chest, all over his face. It was the death of him, finally. Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel where I talk about books. And today I am doing the Clive Barker BookTube Challenge book recommendation tag. Now this tag was created by Cliff over at Cliff's Dark Gems, which is a BookTube channel I really enjoy. He puts out several videos a week, primarily talking about horror and giving great book recommendations. So I'll put a link to his channel and his version of the Clive Barker BookTube tag, which he created. I'll put a link in the description box for you to check out. In this tag, there are 12 challenges or prompts. I call them challenges because some of them are not easy. They're based on Clive Barker's books and movies, and I have to recommend non-Clive Barker books that are similar in a way. Now, what's interesting about this challenge is that, firstly, I'm a huge Clive Barker fan, and one of the first videos I put on this channel was my ranking of all his novels. And Cliff is a huge Clive Barker fan too, but the elements that he chose to extrapolate from Clive Barker's work so that we can recommend similar books are elements that I really hadn't considered before. It's interesting, we're both fans and we both extrapolate different things from his work, which is not surprising. Clive Barker's work is quite varied and layered and intricate and has a lot to offer. So I had a hard time with some of these prompts, but overall it was a fun experiment to do. And I'm excited to share my 12 recommendations with you. But before we do that, if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. I love that the channel is growing and it's keeping me motivated to keep putting out videos, and I do appreciate the support. I'll run a short intro sequence featuring the music of Henryk Górecki, performed by the Kronos Quartet, and I'll see you on the other side to do the Clive Barker BookTube Challenge. Challenge number 1. Clive Barker is an openly gay author. Name a horror book from another diverse author. So I'm going to recommend a book that I recently read. I've just put out a 3-part retrospective of horror from the 1970s, and in preparation for making those videos, I read several authors that I hadn't read before. And one of those was John Saul and his debut book, Suffer the Children. John Saul is also openly gay, and Suffer the Children is a strange book, strange in its tone. It's set in a New England town where all the adults are incredibly cavalier about all the children that are going missing. In fact, one time a child goes missing in the woods, and the chief of police, he's like, well, it's raining, so I guess there's nothing to do but wait until spring and then we can go out looking for him. And the guy he's talking to is like, oh, I suppose you're right. Will you have another drink with me? So they sit by the fire and drink some bourbon. The tone of this book is super strange, but not unpleasant. Several children are killed, and there's a tea party with corpses. So there's a lot to like for the right reader. Challenge number 2. Clive Barker debuted with 6 short story collections titled The Books of Blood. Name a book that has blood or gore on the cover. Now, the Books of Blood were incredibly important to me growing up. They were, well, the first collection came out in 1984. I was a bit too young for horror at that time, so I discovered the books of blood a few years later, and they were instrumental in turning me into an avid horror reader. Now, for a book with blood on the cover, check out The Prince of Nightmares by John McNee. Now, this book was put out by Bloodbound Books, and it's the only book from this publisher that I've read, but I've looked at their catalog, and all their books have lots of blood and gore on their cover. Prince of Nightmares, I talked about in my video Hidden Gems. So here I'll just say quickly that it's about this luxury hotel where people pay a lot of money to stay there so that they can have terrifying nightmares. Some people like to have vivid, terrifying nightmares, and this hotel promises that. So shortly before killing herself, this woman books a stay there for her and her husband, who is an Australian real estate magnate. Now the phantasmagoric nightmare descriptions are beautifully done, so I think this will appeal to Clive Barker fans. Plus we also get to read about an Australian being terrorized, so there's a lot to like here as well. Challenge number 3. Based on Clive Barker's first novel, The Damnation Game. Name a book where a character chooses sides with the devil or with demons. Now, I can think of a few novels where the characters choose sides with the devil. Unfortunately, they're not novels that I can genuinely recommend. So I will recommend the most recent read. Hello, Zvezda. So I will choose the most recent read, and it is also probably the silliest, and that's Ararat by Christopher Golden. A group of explorers / documentary filmmakers, they climb Mount Ararat in search of Noah's Ark. And what they find is an ark that houses the mummified remains of a demon. And this demon can jump around from head to head, possessing people. It's pretty silly. I can't really recommend this book since I didn't really love it. But it does meet the challenge of a book with a character who sides with the devil. And it did win the Bram Stoker Award for Best Horror Novel of the Year in 2017. So some people loved it. Challenge number 4, The Hellbound Heart, a fantastic novella that would go on to spawn the movie franchise Hellraiser. Choose a book with lots of body horror. Now this is interesting because I love body horror. I grew up watching the David Cronenberg movies and loving them. But oddly enough, I have not read much body horror. Now the first book that came to mind was Nick Cutter's The Troop, but that is the book that Cliff recommended in his video. And I can't recommend the same one, right? Great minds think alike. And greatly disturbed minds think alike too, apparently. So instead, I am going to recommend a 19th century classic that we don't often think of as body horror, but I'm going to make the case that it is. And that classic is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. So this guy, Dr. Jekyll, right, he takes this potion which allows him to liberate this other self that he has inside him. And each time he takes this potion, which allows him to explore his dark side, it transforms and shapes his physical appearance, right? We are all familiar with the story, but I will make a confession to you. When I read this book, I was genuinely surprised at how good it is. I know it's a classic, but I have this preconceived idea that 19th century literature is mostly melodramatic nonsense, right? And a lot of it is. but I thoroughly enjoyed this one. And unlike many other classics from that time, in my opinion, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a classic deserved of its moniker. Challenge number 5, based off Clive Barker's 1987 fantasy horror masterpiece, Weaveworld, which may or may not be my favorite Clive Barker book of all time. You'd have to watch my video ranking all the Clive Barker novels to find out for sure. But this challenge asks me to name a horror book that is set in a fantastical world, anything with an interesting blend of horror, sci-fi, and fantasy. Now, nobody does fantasy horror world building like Clive Barker, nobody. But fans of Clive Barker might also appreciate NightWhere by John Everson. A dark, magical place, a private club that invites couples to enter and engage in partner swapping and BDSM and explore their dark erotic fantasies. And the book centers around a couple. They are curious, so they go to NightWhere. And the woman, she is like really into it, yeah? And every time they go back, she wants to go further and further and check out the other private rooms in the back, right? And after a while, her husband, he starts to get kind of nervous because she's getting welts and scars all over her body, and he fears that she's becoming obsessed with this stuff, and she's doing real damage or harm to her body. And he also fears that he's losing his wife to this club. So he has to go in after her. He has to break through all the champagne rooms and the dark tunnels, and he has to penetrate them and get and rescue his wife, even though she hasn't really expressed any desire to be rescued. This book, I think, is obviously inspired by Clive Barker's horror erotica work, but I thought that the descriptions were inventive and very well done. It did leave me, though, to be honest, I enjoyed the book, but after I was finished reading it, it left me wanting to go back and read Clive Barker again. But there's nobody does it like Clive Barker. But this book, NightWhere, is a good homage, I think. Challenge number 6, Imajica, Clive Barker's epic fantasy horror masterpiece. What is the longest horror book you have ever read? And do you prefer shorter books or big door stoppers, and why? I think the longest book the longest horror book I've ever read was probably Carrion Comfort by Dan Simmons, which comes in at 884 pages. Now, this is a book that I frequently see on lists of best horror books of all time. That's why I wanted to read it. I did not love it as much as a lot of people did. It is long, and I felt unnecessarily so. It's an action horror, which is not my favorite subgenre either. And the book reads, I think, more like a screenplay than a novel in many ways. It consists of many elaborate set pieces, action pieces that don't really impact the plot much. It sets up badass villains, and it's well written, but I prefer my horror shorter and tighter. For big door stoppers in literary fiction, that's fine by me, but I prefer my horror to be short and tight and focused. Challenge number 7, based on Clive Barker's 1992 YA masterpiece. I'm using the word masterpiece a lot, but this is Clive Barker, and I think it's warranted. Clive Barker's 1992 YA masterpiece, The Thief of Always. Name your favorite YA horror book. Now, I love The Thief of Always. I think it's fantastic. And even for readers who don't generally appreciate YA, like me, I think it's still a very good read. I do not like YA. I only read YA or young adult books by accident. It's generally books, horror books, that are marketed as general reader books or adult books, but they're not. They're really YA. And this is quite frequent in horror, actually, this misleading marketing, especially in horror of today, sadly. So I will occasionally, since I read blind a lot of the times, I'll get a book that has a buzz, and then I find out that it's YA once I start reading it, and it generally leaves me frustrated and disappointed. However, there is one exception, and that exception is A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. Now, I read A Head Full of Ghosts because I have limited resistance to peer pressure. And when this book came out, everybody was reading it, everybody was talking about it. People were telling me, Michael, you have to read A Head Full of Ghosts. And I would say, ghosts are stupid. I am not going to read a book about ghosts. And then they would say, no, Michael, it's not about ghosts. It's about exorcism and demon possession. To which I'd say, demon possession and exorcism, that's even more stupid than ghosts. I am definitely not going to read this book. But eventually, just too many people were suggesting that I read it, telling me I would love it. So finally, I caved and I read it, and I did love it. I thought it was excellent. Very good. Now, Goodreads has this book listed as an adult book, but it's YA. It's narrated by a teenager, and it's written for teenagers. Nevertheless, I did enjoy it, which is an exception. Challenge number 8, Coldheart Canyon, a criminally underrated horror book from 2001. I talk about Coldheart Canyon a bit in depth in my video 4 Unique Haunted House Stories. And this challenge asks me to name a book where ghosts take center stage. Now that's interesting because I don't think of Coldheart Canyon as a ghost story, ghost book. Although technically they are ghosts, for me they're more like entities created from the intercourse between ghosts and animals, or people, animal, ghost hybrid entities. They're not your standard ghosts, but I suppose technically it's a ghost story. You know how I feel about ghosts. I hate ghosts. Ghost stories are always stupid, lazy, unimaginative storytelling. Always. And I know what you're thinking. You think, hey, Michael, but what about... Nope, always. Always. Ghost stories are never scary, unless you're a 7-year-old, which there's nothing wrong with that, yeah. But they're too unimaginative to be scary. Of course, you may have a different opinion. I would agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong, and that's not helpful to anyone. So I only read a ghost story by accident. I'll read blind oftentimes, and I won't realize it's a ghost story until I'm already into the story. Fortunately, that doesn't happen too often. Although it has happened twice, and oddly enough, I thoroughly enjoyed both of those books. Although ghosts in these books play a minor role, and honestly, they're completely unnecessary to the story. But they're in there. They are ghosts, and I'll name them here because they're both very good horror books. And the first is Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, which I know that a lot of people love. The Shining, it's a beloved classic. But the sequel, Dr. Sleep, I think is grossly underrated. It's an excellent horror book. And the other is Bloodkin by Steve Rasnic Tam, which is another excellent Bram Stoker award-winning horror novel. But in both of these cases, the ghosts make a short appearance, and they're completely unnecessary to the story. Although it does provide, I guess, good eye muscle exercise. You know, gets the eye rolling muscles working, I suppose. And now we are moving on to the movie section of this Clive Barker BookTube tag. These prompts are based on movies written and directed by Clive Barker. Challenge number 9, Hellraiser. Name a book set in hell. So if you would ask me to name a book set in hell, immediately I'm going to think of the Scarlet Gospels. The Scarlet Gospel. But that's a Clive Barker book. But it's one that gives us a gorgeous tour of hell. It's super well done. Another horror book that is grossly underrated. I think it's because a lot of Hellraiser fans took issue with the fact that Clive Barker went against the mythos that the movies created. But on its own merits, I think it's fantastic. Other than the Scarlet Gospel, I can't really think of another book that I've read that is set in hell. So I'm going to stretch the challenge a little bit and name instead a book that is set in a hellish landscape, a hell on earth, if you will. And I have a great one for that, and that is Lost Child by Adam Nevill. This is I'm a huge Adam Nevill fan, and this is one of his better ones. And it's set in a future, I think 40, 25, 30 years into the future, where environmental disasters have led to the deterioration of society, political upheaval, mass immigration, and chaos, right? So this guy, he has to infiltrate the criminal underground in England to try to rescue his daughter who has been kidnapped. And it's action-packed, it's violent, and it's even scary at times, and it's definitely set in hell on earth, if you will. Challenge number 10, The Midnight Meat Train. Now, this is a movie that was based off of one of the short stories in the Books of Blood. And this challenge asks me to name a story that takes place underground. Yes, I believe The Midnight Meat Train takes place in the London Underground. Could be New York subway, I don't remember exactly. So it could be a subway, cave system, mines, anything that is below the surface. And if you want below the surface, I am going to recommend The Deep by Nick Cutter. Now, I talk about this book extensively in my video, Scariest Books of All Time, because the first half of this book I thought was truly terrifying, very claustrophobic. It's about this man who goes down into a underwater research facility deep in the Mariana Trench, which is like 10 kilometers below sea level, deep in the sea. And the descriptions are fantastic. It's because of the air pressure and the darkness. I mean, things feel different. The sounds sound different. Everything looks different. And it creates this hyper claustrophobic atmosphere, and also there's quite a bit of body horror in this one as well, as Nick Cutter is wont to do. So for underground horror, yeah, I definitely recommend this. My contention with this book is that the third act is overly long. But for the first half of the book, I thought was excellent and very scary. Moving on to prompt number 11, Candyman. Another movie based on one of the short stories in the Books of Blood, The Forbidden, which I think is one of the best horror short stories ever written, in my opinion. And oddly enough, recently, maybe 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago, I saw the movie Candyman. I had a friend come visit me, and we decided to watch a horror movie. We watched Candyman, the more recent iteration. I think it came out last year, I want to say. And I was not expecting to like it because since I love the Forbidden so much, I thought, well, it's not going to tell the same story. I'm going to have issues with it. But I watched it anyway because I'm such a nice host, yeah. Turns out I really liked Candyman. I mean, the story it tells is a different story than The Forbidden. It's loosely based on the story, but I thought it was very well done. I quite enjoyed it. This prompt asks me to name a book based on myths, legends, or folklore. And I can think of many, but again, not many that I really liked that I would feel comfortable recommending. So I'm going to stretch a little bit and I'm going to recommend The Toll by Cherie Priest. Another book I've talked about in another video, books I recommend for Shirley Jackson fans because it has this kind of dark magic fantasy that's it's pretty cool and pretty reminiscent of Shirley Jackson. But it's the story about a small town in the south of the United States where when you cross a bridge, every 13 years, if you cross the bridge, then this beast takes you as its sacrifice. So it kind of plays on the myth of crossing a bridge and there's a troll that you have to contend with. In this story, the toll, it's not a troll, but a different kind of beast, but it's similar kind of myth. Very fun book, not necessarily scary. I think it would be a good book for non-horror readers as well. But it has this kind of magic in the town that's almost ordinary. And there are two older witches who are content with not fighting this entity and just letting it take its sacrifice every 13 years. But eventually, after a while, they decide they're going to fight back. And then it gets fun. Yeah. Moving on to the last challenge, Nightbreed, which is a movie based on the Clive Barker novel Cabal, starring David Cronenberg, actually. Name a novel where the reader is more likely to feel sympathy for the creatures or the monsters rather than the humans in the story. Because in Cabal, there is a village built underground on the outskirts of a town or in an abandoned cemetery. I can't remember exactly. And these beast-like figures live there because they have to escape the above ground world. Otherwise, they would be hunted down by humans. And this guy, this human, young, good-looking man, he is accused of being a serial killer. So he has to kind of hide out and run away. So he decides to hide out in this village, this underground village, where they are not receptive to humans so much. So there's a bit of a conflict there, but we do side with the beasts. And the book that I will recommend that is similar in that regard is Dark Harvest by Norman Partridge. Now this is a fun Halloween book, which I talk about in my video, Fun Halloween Reads. It's every Halloween in the small town in the United States. Every Halloween, this beast is created, and the creation of the beast is quite inventive. So this guy goes into a cornfield and he carves out a jack-o'-lantern, sticks it onto a scarecrow, and then the vines, they come and they twist through the body and they morph into hands and arms, and he stuffs the torso with candies, puts a butcher knife in its hand and sends off this monster into town to try to make it into town and alive, actually, while the town folk, the teenage boys in the town, will try to hunt him down, and it's like a murder chase. It's a fun book. It's more, even though there's quite a bit of blood and a relatively high body count, it's more of an action story than a horror story, but it's really good and it's very Halloween. If I had a tradition of reading the same book every year for Halloween, it would be that one, because it's relatively short, 170, 180 pages, and it's a lot of fun. Well done. And there it is. I have successfully completed the Clive Barker BookTube challenge. I want to thank Cliff at Cliff's Dark Gems for creating this tag and for thinking of me when he was tagging people. I would say overall, in all the books that I've talked about, for Clive Barker fans especially, I would highlight The Prince of Nightmares and NightWhere as being particularly good recommendations for Clive Barker fans. I am going to tag Jason's Weird Reads because I know he is a fan of horror and he is a fan of fantasy. So I would think naturally that he would be a fan of Clive Barker. I don't know, we'll find out. If you would like to do this tag, take this challenge, please do. And please tag me or let me know about your video so I can check it out. And thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.